Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into a fascinating investigation of how expert testimony actually shapes the education policies governing our classrooms. We're looking at the direct link between what gets said in a hearing room and the actual laws being written. It's a really compelling story of data, testimony, and the sheer power of a viral moment.
So to understand how we got here, we have to plunge straight into a viral panic that's completely captured the nation's attention. I mean, is technology biologically breaking an entire generation's brains? That's the core question that prompted recent congressional hearings and triggered local news reports, like those from Fox 13, warning parents that screen time is literally making Gen Z less cognitively capable than previous generations.
And the spark for this recent wave of legislation?
Well, was a striking piece of testimony delivered to the U.S. Senate by Dr. Cooney Horvath, a cognitive neuroscientist. He stated it pretty plainly to the Senate, saying, "Our kids are less cognitively capable than we were at their age." He advanced this very strict biological mechanism framing to lawmakers, basically arguing that screens fundamentally circumvent the biological process of learning entirely, which effectively makes them incompatible with human brain development.
And people definitely listened. The stakes here are incredibly high. The video of Dr. Horvath's oral testimony alone racked up over 2 million views. But it didn't just generate clicks, it directly influenced real-world policy. Just look at Missouri's House Bill 2230, which seeks to limit technology in schools. It passed overwhelmingly, 143-10, and cited this exact testimony in its public record.
Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1. The 4-artifact drift, following the paper trail.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is a forensic white paper by AI governance consultant Basil C. Puglisi. He decided to actually investigate the paper trail behind Dr. Horvath's claims, and his analysis uncovers a structural pattern of strategic ambiguity, or what he calls the 4-artifact drift. You can see how Dr. Horvath's message shifted across 4 completely different artifacts: his book, a podcast interview, his written testimony, and finally his oral testimony. In the artifacts meant for cautious academic audiences, like the written testimony or his book, Horvath included distinct hedges. He specifically stated his work is not a call to reject technology, but when it came to his oral testimony, which traveled widely to millions of viewers and lawmakers, he delivered an unhedged, completely binary ultimatum.
To see just how stark this disparity is, consider this comparison. Just 6 days prior to his Senate appearance, Horvath spoke on a podcast meant for educators. And there, he explicitly conceded that there are categories where EdTech actually works, and he endorsed context-dependent deployment. Yet, in his oral testimony to policymakers, all that nuance completely vanished. He gave a binary ultimatum: remove the technology or surrender. He ruled out method governance entirely, pushing a rigid biological mechanism framing that just blames the medium itself rather than addressing how that medium is actually deployed in a classroom.
Which brings us to an interesting question. Did the other expert witnesses on the panel push back, or did they stay true to their own research? Let's look at part 2, the witness drift map, a panel compounding.
And this brilliantly illustrates that Dr. Horvath wasn't an isolated case. According to Puglisi's white paper, the entire panel drifted into an artificial consensus. If you look at the drift mapping, you can actually verify each witness's published research against what they said in their oral testimony. It's wild. All 4 expert witnesses arrived with a published research record that directly contradicted the binary ban the tech consensus they collectively delivered in that hearing room. Let's rapidly break down these contradictions, starting with generational psychologist Dr. Twenge. Her published research carefully distinguishes between leisure screen time, which definitely correlates with negative outcomes, and instructional screen time, which operates quite differently. Yet her oral policy position effectively erased that very distinction. She endorsed bell-to-bell phone bans that don't differentiate at all between just scrolling social media and using a device for structured, governed learning.
Then we have education consultant Emily Cherkin. Her core research philosophy is that friction is the learning process, that having productive struggle is absolutely essential to cognitive development. But her oral testimony completely contradicted this. She actually advocated for removing every single digital occasion for friction in K-5 classrooms. So her cognitive diagnosis, that friction matters, points in a completely different direction than her oral prescription, which was to just ban the medium entirely.
Finally, we look at Dr. Radesky. Now, her research correctly diagnoses upstream issues, urging a real shift to focus on the design of tech products, ensuring they don't feature those engagement-prolonging mechanisms.
But instead of sticking to design governance, she totally abandoned that nuance in her oral testimony. She signed on to an access-banning consensus that focuses purely on removal, completely ignoring structural design.
Part 3. The Hidden Flaw, the Weird Bias Timeline.
Now, prepare for a massive plot twist regarding the foundational data Horvath cited. To back up his claim that kids are getting less capable, he pointed to a drop in standardized test scores starting around 2010. But Puglisi's audit uncovers a massive hidden flaw here. To understand it, we first have to define weird bias. Weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Back in 2010, a foundational methodological critique was published showing that behavioral and cognitive findings were derived primarily from these populations are systematically unrepresentative of humanity as a whole. And guess what? The instruments measuring cognition were heavily built on exactly this weird foundation.
Let's move to and see how this builds when we map it onto a timeline, because a completely different picture emerges. Pre-2010, test scores were generally rising. Then, in 2010, we see the drop in PISA cognitive scores that Horvath points to. But exactly simultaneously in 2010, that foundational weird bias critique was published. It deeply questioned the validity of those very measurement instruments, especially as testing populations were shifting and expanding globally. Post-2010, we just see continued cognitive decline narratives built entirely on these highly scrutinized instruments.
Puglisi's overarching point is that the data foundation is fundamentally confounded. The correlation Horvath draws between tech adoption and dropping scores completely ignores the shifting demographics and the weird bias critique of the testing instruments themselves. The methodological discipline required to disentangle which variable actually produced the decline. It simply doesn't exist in the Senate testimony.
Part 4. The real solution, method governance.
If the blame the tool and ban the tech mentality was built on contradictions and confounded data, what does the science actually support? Let's pivot away from the panic. So the crucial point is this. The variable driving learning is the instructional method, not the digital medium. Over 60 years of cognitive science shows us that passive deployment of any medium, whether it's an iPad or a traditional paper worksheet, produces weak learning. Active governance of the method, however, produces strong learning. The problem isn't the screen itself, it's how the screen is being deployed in that environment.
This is where Puglisi presents a framework called method governance. This is the standard that schools, educators, and policymakers really should be adopting instead of these overarching binary tech bans. It's a standard that's applicable to any tool deployed in a learning environment to ensure it drives actual cognitive development rather than just passive consumption.
Method governance basically boils down to 3 highly actionable practical parts. Number 1, there must be active cognitive demand on the learner. They have to be engaging, struggling, and thinking, not just passively watching. Number 2, there must be outcome evidence of the deployment method. We need proof that the way a tool is used actually results in learning. And number 3, named human accountability. A human teacher must have the absolute authority to evaluate, modify, or reject any tool that fails to produce results. And the beauty of this is that it applies equally to laptops, AI, old-school textbooks, and human teachers themselves.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to take away from this explainer. If a passive digital worksheet is bad for learning, a passive paper worksheet isn't going to be much better, right? We really have to ask ourselves, are we fixing education by removing screens or just putting a passive analog system back in place? If we don't address the underlying teaching methods through method governance, a binary ban on technology might not actually solve anything at all. Thanks for joining me to unpack this fascinating intersection of expert testimony and education policy. Keep asking questions and keep looking at the data.